Tell me, what time is it where you are? Where in the world are you listening from tonight? If you're new here, welcome. This is Boring History for Sleep, a slow, quiet journey through forgotten corners of the past. You enjoy calm storytelling about the details nobody talks about. Tap, subscribe, and let this become your nightly ritual. Now, let the fire fade, the stone cool, the city of Rome rise again, slowly, quietly, in the soft shadows of memory. Asterisk, the air in Rome was unusually still that night. Even the Tiber seemed to hesitate in its movement, as if the river itself were holding its breath. It was July in the year 64 AD, and the city, already choked with heat, dust, and the restless murmurs of rumor, was bracing for nothing in particular. The nights in Rome were often loud, taverns echoing with laughter, carts rattling over stones, dogs barking at unseen threats. But this night felt different, not because it was quieter, but because it wasn't in the tightly packed wooden neighborhoods near the Circus Maximus. The smell of sweat, oil lamps, and old timber hung low like a curtain. The alleyways of Rome's lower quarters, especially around the Subura district, were not designed for order, were built by habit, by need, and by ignorance of what wood could become in a dry summer. Its tall insulae, Rome's rickety apartment blocks leaned at awkward angles, sometimes with balconies practically touching the buildings across the alley. Rope bridges tied windows together, fabric awnings stretched across streets, trapping heat by day and tension by night. One small flame in the wrong place could undo it all, and that's exactly what happened. No one truly knows how it started. Some said it was an accident, a dropped lamp, perhaps, or a cooking fire left untended by a dozing vintner. Others claimed it was deliberate, whispered about agents of chaos or the emperor's men. But when the fire began on the night of July 18th, it didn't care who started it. It simply moved. It crawled along timber walls, skipped across dry canvas, and climbed up oil-soaked stairwells. Then hours, it consumed entire insulae like a hungry beast finally unchained. The city was built for spectacle, not safety. Nero's Rome was a theater of ego and empire, and nowhere was that ego more visible than in its architecture, tall, unstable, and close-packed. The fire began at the southeastern end of the Circus Maximus, Rome's colossal chariot racing stadium. The space was vast, nearly 2,000 feet long, ringed by vendors, stalls, and wooden seating that provided perfect kindling. The wind did the rest. Even the shape of the city aided the destruction. Rome wasn't built on a grid, but around hills and political needs. The seven hills, Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, and their neighbors, shaped the layout like a spilled basket. Streets twisted upward, funneled downward, and turned in ways no planner would ever intend. Escape routes were few. Fire breaks were non-existent in Rome's firefighting methods. They belonged to a city far smaller, far calmer. There were no organized fire brigades as we think of them. The vigils, Rome's night watchmen and firefighters, were ill-equipped and overmatched. They had buckets, axes, sometimes even vinegar, poured on walls to slow the spread of flames, but against a fire fed by wind, hunger, and panic, they were more symbolic than practical. Their chain bucket lines were slow and often broken by fear. People ran instead of helped. Wooden ladders fell. Crowds screamed over the roar of collapsing roofs, and the fire roared on. By morning, the sky was the color of copper. Smoke blanketed the city like a burial shroud. The smell of burning grain, cloth, flesh, and plaster mixed with the sharp ting of ash. Refugees were everywhere, staggering toward the Tiber, climbing the hills, clutching bundles of whatever they had managed to save. Infants, chickens, a single plate of family God. Rome was suddenly a city of the displaced. What's rarely remembered is this: the fire didn't just destroy, revealed that the grandeur of Rome, the golden temples, the marble columns, the power of the Senate, was built atop a city of dry sticks. Okay. It exposed how fragile it all was. Okay. The emperor's palace could gleam on the Palatine, but just below it, citizens lived in conditions where one candle could unmake a world. It revealed the inequality written into the very bones of the capital. For the rich, escape was possible. For the poor, it was not. The fire burned for 6 days, but that first night was when it won. That first night was when Rome learned it had no plan. That first night was when survivors realized the government had no water barrels ready, no escape maps drawn, no instructions posted. Rome, the heart of an empire, was unprepared for its own vulnerabilities, and as the sun rose on a city changed forever, as people gathered by the river and stared back at the smoldering heart of the empire, one question formed like smoke behind their eyes. Had this really been an accident? Or had someone let the fire burn? Asterisk, the flames did not respect the daylight. They burned through it. On the second day, they climbed the Palatine Hill and rolled through the Forum like an invading army. Marble cracked and blackened. Bronze statues sagged and melted. Sacred temples, some standing for centuries, were consumed. Smoke slithered up into the sky, blotting out the sun, while below, in the tight quarters of the Subura and Velabram, the fire danced with reckless freedom. And yet, in the midst of all this ruin, the question on everyone's tongue had already turned to Nero. Where was he the time of the fire? Emperor Nero was not in the city. He was away at Antium, his coastal villa roughly 35 miles south of Rome. Word reached him on the first night. Sources later claimed he returned swiftly, perhaps even before the second morning. Some accounts say he arrived in haste and opened his palace gardens to refugees. Others, more malicious in tone, claimed he arrived to watch the fire, not fight it. The historian Tacitus, writing years later, tells us that Nero took to a private stage and sang of the fall of Troy while his own city burned, comparing himself to Priam, the doomed king of another ancient empire. It's a famous image, Nero, lyre in hand, strumming while the capital crumbled. But the historical truth is less theatrical and more disturbing. There is no solid evidence Nero played the lyre while Rome burned. But the myth stuck because it fit. Nero was already known for his vanity, his eccentricity, his detachment from the suffering of common people. The Rome of his imagination was one of grandeur and performance, not the crowded wooden slums that now smoldered in ruin. His enemies whispered that he had ordered the fire, and here details become dangerous. Nero had long envisioned a more magnificent Rome, wider streets, stone buildings, grander symmetry. Fire, to some, was simply too convenient, clearing away the clutter of the old city and offering him a blank canvas for his imperial masterpiece. Within months, he would begin construction on the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace unlike anything Rome had ever seen. It stretched across the Palatine Esquiline, Celian Hills, a luxury compound complete with artificial lakes, grottos, dining halls with rotating ceilings, and a colossal bronze statue of himself. But to build it, large swaths of the destroyed city had to remain cleared. The people saw this, and they didn't forget. By the third day of the fire, panic had turned to suspicion. In some neighborhoods, men were reportedly caught throwing torches into houses that had not yet caught fire. When questioned, they claimed they were acting under orders, but from whom? No one knew for certain. Nero's administration denied involvement. Of course, a whisper spread faster than fire. Blame needed a place to land. It found the Christians. At the time, Christianity was still a small and largely misunderstood movement in Rome, seen by many as a strange offshoot of Judaism, lacked temples, sacrifices, or recognizable rituals. Christians met in private homes, spoke in parables, and refused to worship the emperor. Their refusal to conform, combined with their secrecy, made them ideal scapegoats. Nero, perhaps sensing the danger of public anger turning toward him, turned it instead toward them. Tacitus records that Nero punished the Christians, not for arson, exactly, but for hatred of the human race. It was a vague but damning accusation. Christians were arrested, interrogated, and tortured until they confessed, whether truthfully or not. Then came the executions. Some were crucified, others torn apart by dogs, and still others were set alight, literally turned into human torches to light Nero's garden parties. It was brutality dressed as justice, and yet the Roman people, even those who had lost everything, began to turn against Nero, not in open rebellion, but in exhausted disillusionment. Many viewed the punishments not as justice, but as cruelty, punishment that exceeded the crime. If the Christians were guilty, why such theater? If they were innocent, then who had really set Rome ablaze? Meanwhile, those who had survived this fire faced a quieter horror: displacement. The fire had destroyed 10 of Rome's 14 districts completely or partially. Hundreds of thousands were now homeless. Tents sprang up on the city's outskirts. Refugee camps lined the Tiber. Food prices soared. The city's grain supply, already vulnerable due to naval disruptions, now had to feed even more mouths. Famine loomed. Nero did attempt relief measures. He arranged for food to be imported at reduced prices. He opened his own gardens for shelter, but the damage was done. The fire had stripped Rome bare, not only its buildings, but its illusions of control. And underneath all of it, Rome's old vulnerabilities lay exposed. The city had always lived close to chaos, balanced on the promise of order enforced from above. But now, as ash settled into every crevice of the ruined capital, that promise felt more like a lie. Why had Rome, the city of laws and legions, been unable to stop a single fire? And why did so many feel that the emperor had allowed or even welcomed the destruction? The flames that consumed Rome eventually died. The heat they left behind lingered for generations, not just in memory, but in architecture, in politics, and in the way Romans saw their own empire. By the seventh day after the fire began, only wisps of smoke remained. What had once been districts alive with the noise of shopkeepers, carts, orators, pickpockets, children, and philosophers had been reduced to blackened rubble and twisted stone. Some marble had exploded from within, cracked by the heat. Entire neighborhoods, especially those near the Circus Maximus, were simply gone, erased as if by a careless brushstroke. For the average Roman citizen, the return to normal was a fantasy. Rents had vanished along with buildings. Families camped under makeshift awnings or in the ruins of temples. Some returned to salvage what they could, pulling half-burned beams, searching for coins buried beneath collapsed floors, or simply sitting among the ashes as though waiting for the city to rebuild itself. But that was not how Rome worked. It would rebuild, but not for them. Nero seized the moment. Publicly, he announced new regulations. Homes must now be spaced apart. Buildings must be made of stone instead of wood. Streets were to be widened, and open courtyards required to limit future fires. It sounded, on paper, like the voice of reason, reform, order, safety, but those same reforms created gaps that only the wealthy could fill. Stone was expensive, so was land in a city now gutted by fire. Small merchants who had once owned modest shops near the Forum found themselves unable to meet the new requirements. Their plots were swallowed up by elite estates, luxury porticos, and Nero's sweeping construction projects. Rome's lower classes were pushed further outward to the margins of a city that at once pretended they belonged at its heart. and in the literal heart of the ruined city, something new began to rise. The Domus, Aurea, Nero's golden house. It was not just a home. It was a palace complex, a statement, a provocation. The burned districts had been conveniently cleared to make space for it, covering over 100 acres. Its ceilings were inlaid with ivory. Its walls were decorated with precious stones and frescoes that mimicked gardens, skies, and mythic landscapes. It had rooms designed to smell like flowers, fountains that ran with perfumed water, an artificial lake so vast it resembled a private sea. And at the center of it all, quite literally, stood a 100-foot statue of Nero himself, fashioned in the style of a Roman god. This was not a rebuilding for the people. This was an empire's self-worship. It's cast in gold and built on Ashdod, but the illusion of grandeur was never complete. Though the Domus, Aurea, was a marvel of architecture, it was a political disaster. Romans, especially the senatorial class, loathed it. They saw it in its scale, not vision, but vanity. They saw a man who had let their history burn and replaced it with a monument to his own ego. The discontent. Smo, Ldered. 3 years later, in 67 AD, Nero left Rome to tour Greece, not in exile, but in performance. He sang, he competed in games, he acted on stage. He played the lyre, not as a ruler, but as an artist, desperate for validation. Back home, however, the Senate's patience had burned away as surely as the Circus Maximus in 68 AD. Revolt finally came. The governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, rose in rebellion. One by one, others joined. And when the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, the man who had once bathed in rosewater and presided over glittering halls fled, lone, abandoned by most. He took refuge in a freedman's villa outside Rome. With assassins closing in, he ended his life with the help of a servant, muttering the final words, Qualis, artifex, perio. What an artist dies in me. The Domus, Aurea, fell into disrepair. It was later stripped of valuables, filled in with earth, and eventually built over. Colosseum, perhaps the most iconic Roman structure of all, was erected right on top of the lake Nero had built for himself. Emperors that followed wanted to erase him, bury him, and deny him even the ashes of legacy. But history doesn't burn so easily. The fire of 64 AD made a pivot point. It revealed more than it destroyed. It showed how fragile a city of marble could be, how power could bend disaster to its own benefit, how the poor always suffered first, and how history would always be written from the palace steps, even if those steps had once overlooked corpses turned to cinders. Even today, deep beneath modern Rome, fragments of Nero's golden house still linger in the soil. Artists centuries later would accidentally rediscover it, climbing into its buried halls, lighting torches to admire the faded frescoes, and sketching by candlelight what remained. The fire was gone, but the walls still whispered, and as you drift through this quiet ruin of thought, you might wonder how many other empires have burned silently, not with flame, but with forgetfulness. How many disasters begin not with fire, but with design. Asterisk, you're standing in silence where the ashes have barely settled. The smoke of the great fire still haunts the air, though days have passed. Rubble is piled knee-high across districts, once crowded with shopkeepers, bakers, beggars, and officials. Entire families sit with their backs against shattered temple walls, wrapped in whatever cloth they managed to save. And among them, the whispered name keeps returning. Nero, not in rage, not in mourning, confusion, because the emperor, they say, has returned not with comfort, but with plans. The Domus, Aurea, the golden house, would not begin with a blueprint, but with an idea so bold, it felt more like a hallucination. A home for one man. It spanned an entire city. No ruler before had ever dared to think this large. Augustus had modestly styled himself as first citizen. Nero made no such pretenses. Rome had burned. Now it would become his. The vision was unlike anything the empire had seen. Where others might have rebuilt the city for its people, Nero looked out over the charred earth and saw opportunity. The hills that once blocked the skyline were to be reshaped. The densely packed slums and wooden homes would not return. In their place, courtyards, vineyards, sculptures, and halls made not for governance, but for pleasure. The Domus Aurea was never meant to be a palace in the traditional sense. It was an experience, a sequence of illusions made permanent in stone, paint, water, and light. Some rooms were designed with rotating ceilings, mimicking the heavens. Others could release fragrant petals from above, as if spring itself obeyed. The emperor. Marble of every known color was hauled in from across the empire. Ceilings were covered with gilded mosaics. Pools mirrored stars, where the common man had once lived. A god now planned to walk. And yet, this vision was not only about luxury, it was also a response to failure. Because, despite the opulence, Nero knew what had happened. The people had turned. Rome had burned under his rule. The Senate no longer whispered behind closed doors, murmured in public. And though he denied it, he could feel the weight of eyes upon him. Accusations, rumors, doubt. The Domus Aurea would be more than a monument. It would be an erasure. A new Rome with Nero at the center, dazzling enough to make everyone forget. But what's often forgotten is how fragile this grand dream was, even from the beginning to build it. Nero relied not just on architects, but on magicians of illusion. Chief among them were Severus and Celer, two men not known for building civic infrastructure, but for crafting marvels. Cave designed dining rooms with ceilings that could drip perfume, hidden chambers where light could be reflected through glass and bronze to imitate dawn, grottos lit to appear like moonlit lakes. The boundary between reality and performance was the entire point. Yet, this ambition came at a cost, not just financial, but emotional. Rome, the city of stoic tradition and ancestral reverence, was not ready for such extravagance. The poor starved outside its gates. Nero prepared pleasure halls, while public funds vanished into opal walls. Senators watched their influence shrink with every brick. And perhaps, worst of all, the Domus Aurea wasn't just extravagant. It was new, un-Roman, foreign in style, Hellenistic in spirit, Greek in design. And that, to the Roman elite, felt like betrayal. Still, construction pressed on to make space for the complex. Nero cleared not just ruins, but also resistance. The Forum was slowly reshaped to his liking. Statues of others were moved or destroyed. New laws permitted imperial projects to override existing property lines. The artificial lake alone, dug out at immense cost, displaced hundreds who had resettled after the fire. Every piece of the Golden House came at someone else's loss. But Nero, as always, saw himself not as a thief, but as an artist. He once told the Senate that his greatest desire was to leave behind something beautiful, something that would cause later generations to weep not with grief, but with awe. He did not want to rule the empire. He wanted to impress it, to astonish it, to make it remember his name, not for cruelty or cowardice, but for imagination. And yet, that desire, so theatrical, so emotional, was built on unstable ground, because the fire had not only cleared Rome's districts, it had also cleared away Nero's remaining goodwill. And as each column rose, as each marble tile was polished, the people began to ask, how much gold does a city need, for it forgets its own children? Asterisk, construction echoed across Rome like a heartbeat of defiance. Stones were laid, walls painted, statues lifted by pulley systems over streets still bearing the smell of smoke. The Domus Aurea rose, not as a building, but as a symbol. For Nero, a legacy in marble. For everyone else, a golden scar, no matter how perfectly carved its arches, how delicately painted its ceilings. The memory of what it replaced was too fresh, a bitter dot. And yet, from an architectural standpoint, the Golden House was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The vestibule alone was a marvel, a covered colonnade that stretched over 100 meters, lined with fountains, gardens, and ornamental flora brought in from across the empire. Exotic animals wandered the enclosed lawns. Guests, those privileged enough to be invited, were led through a sequence of environments that blurred the boundaries between nature and design. Light was controlled like an instrument. Some rooms glowed with reflected sun, channeled through bronze mirrors. Others were deliberately dim, mimicking the mood of dusk. Scented water dripped from hidden channels. Floors were inlaid with semi-precious stones from Egypt, the East, and Hispania. There were entire dining halls that rotated gently on mechanical gears powered by water, a kind of turning sky beneath a fresco dome. But this was not Rome as the people knew it. This was Nero's Rome, theatrical, indulgent, disconnected from pain. And therein lay the problem, for many citizens and senators alike. The Domus Aurea felt like an insult carved in limestone. The fire had left hundreds of thousands without homes, yet the emperor had built himself a paradise. Rome was in the midst of reconstruction, but funds were flowing not into aqueducts or grain relief, but into perfumed fountains and ivory ceilings. The Senate, always careful not to oppose too loudly, began murmuring behind closed doors. Privately, they were disgusted. Publicly, they still clapped. Nero's influence over Rome's political elite had long depended on spectacle. His earlier years had seen gladiator games, public races, theater performances, all free, all excessive, all designed to keep the public eye distracted. But now, the distractions felt too distant. Nero's own reputation had withered. The fire had changed public perception in a way that no amount of art or architecture could repair. Even the punishments inflicted on the Christians meant to redirect anger had left a strange unease in the city. Streets whispered of cruelty. And as gold leaf curled across the walls of Nero's palace, trust curled into suspicion. Even those inside the Domus Aurea could sense it. Visitors left dazzled, but not grateful. Ambassadors gawked at the splendor, but then questioned its stability. What kind of emperor needed this? What kind of ruler could justify this palace rising from the ruins of his own capital? More troubling still, Nero no longer seemed present. In his own creation, he would walk the halls at night. Yes, he would sing, sometimes alone, his voice echoing across mosaics. But increasingly, his passion for the palace began to sour. He obsessed over details, the angle of a beam, the color of a frieze, yet rarely lingered to enjoy them. Artists and architects complained of constant changes. The emperor would command entire walls to be redone, only to undo them again. It was as if no version of the Domus Aurea could satisfy the vision he carried inside. And the deeper he went into the construction of the palace, the further he withdrew from Rome itself. He stopped appearing at Senate meetings. He gave fewer addresses to the public. His attention turned to Greece, to music, to philosophy. His obsession with the stage deepened, and soon he would make a decision that sealed his legacy: a public tour of the Greek provinces, not as ruler, but as performer. In 67 AD, he departed, leaving behind the half-complete wonder that was supposed to secure his place in history. He left Rome aching, impatient, and leaderless, while he competed in Olympic Games and sang before audiences in Corinth. Rome simmered, not in flame, but in silence. The Domus Aurea, in his absence, became a monument to disconnect. Even the laborers grew restless. Craftsmen, once proud to contribute to what they thought would be a legacy, now spoke in hushed tones of rebellion. The Senate, feeling abandoned, began to explore dangerous alliances. Governors in the provinces, especially in Gaul and Hispania, began to calculate Rome's weakness. And so, even as water trickled through the marble channels of Nero's man-made paradise, something else was leaking beneath the surface: loyalty, patience, and the illusion that the Golden House would ever be loved. Asterisk, by the time Nero returned from his self-styled tour of Greece, Rome had changed. Not visibly. The palace still gleamed. The forum still buzzed with market sounds, and the Senate still offered the appearance of compliance. But underneath, the mood had hardened into something brittle. The emperor had left his people to grieve alone after the fire. He had chased applause in foreign theaters while his capital wrestled with hunger, inflation, and slow reconstruction. The Domus Aurea, once announced as a gift to the city, now loomed over it like an unwanted god. And worse still, the people had started to forget why they feared him. That was dangerous. Nero's return was not triumphant. His victories in the arts, carefully rigged, lavishly rewarded, were mocked behind fans and goblets. His obsession with performance, once indulged as eccentricity, now seemed to many as detachment bordering on madness. His enemies, real and imagined, multiplied. Governors in distant provinces began to ignore imperial commands. Rome was beginning to look at Nero not as emperor, but as an inconvenience, and the Golden House became the center of that resentment. The very scale of it made it easy to hate. Its land stretched so far that even senators' homes had been overshadowed or displaced. The public saw Nero's giant, the statue of himself, the Colossus Neronis, not as art, but arrogance. Rumors swirled that Nero planned to rename Rome itself, to call it Neropolis. But what truly doomed him was not art or fire. It was abandonment. In 68 AD, rebellion, finally, ignited not in Rome, but in Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor and senator, declared open revolt. He accused Nero of moral corruption, economic mismanagement, and betrayal of Roman traditions. Others soon joined. Savius Savius Sulpicius Galba declared himself the rightful emperor, with the backing of both local legions and Roman financiers, eager for a return to stability. Rome's elite, exhausted by spectacle and fearful of civil war, began to withdraw their support. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal to Nero, were bribed and swayed. The Senate, sensing the shift, declared him an enemy of the state. Nero fled. The man who had once bathed in scented waters and dined beneath falling flower petals now wandered outside Rome, dressed in simple clothing, begging loyal freedmen to help him escape. When he finally realized no path remained, he asked a companion to help him take his own life. His last words were whispered with the trembling voice of a man who had always wanted admiration more than power. Qualis, artifacts, Periel. What an artist dies in me. He died not as a ruler, not even as a man, but as an abandoned performance. And the Domus Aurea. It lived on. For a while, Galba, then Otho, then Vitellius. Rome tumbled through emperors in quick succession. But Vespasian, who would soon bring calm after chaos, saw what the Domus Aurea symbolized. He understood that Rome could not afford to remember Nero's palace, so he began a careful erasure. The artificial lake was drained. The statue was moved and repurposed. The vast grounds were opened to the public again, and over what had been Nero's shimmering courtyard, a new structure began to rise, the Flavian Amphitheater. You know it today as the Colosseum, built using spoils from the Jewish war. It would become the emblem of Roman endurance, Roman spectacle, Roman civilization. But beneath it, literally buried beneath its foundation, still lay the bones of Nero's dream. Mosaic fragments, collapsed corridors, KL'd vaults, filled with dirt to erase their memory. Ironically, it was that burial that preserved them. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, workers digging near the Colosseum fell into caverns of strange beauty. Frescoes still clung to the ceilings. Paint still shimmered in torchlight. The Domus Aurea had become a myth, and yet here it was, intact, quiet, forgotten. Artists like Raphael descended into its halls, copying its motifs, reviving its visual language. The dream Nero built to survive eternity did survive, but not as he intended, not as glory, not as legacy, but as a ghost in the dirt. A whisper beneath amphitheater crowds, a lesson buried in beauty. And maybe that's the real legacy, that even the most golden ambition, when cut off from the people it claims to impress, becomes little more than a ruin waiting to be rediscovered. So now, beneath the Colosseum, tourists walk unaware above the foundations of a dream Rome tried to forget. And if you listen closely, beneath the stone and shadow, can you still hear him? It's that lonely voice, once so proud, once so desperate to be remembered. What an artist dies in me. When fire broke out in ancient Rome, it was not just an emergency of flame. It was a test of systems. In Rome, for all its statues, laws, and legions, had no system that could stand up to fire. As the sun fell on July 18th, 64 AD, few citizens suspected that their city was about to be swallowed. They had seen fires before. Minor blazes were almost ordinary. Rome had always been a city made from flammable things: wood, straw, wax, cloth, and oil. In the Subura, in the Velabrum, and along the crooked alleys near the Aventine, it was common to smell smoke from a neighbor's hearth or from a tipped oil lamp. People didn't worry. They simply shouted, poured water, beat flames with cloaks. Fires ended because neighbors made demand. But this time, it did not end. And the first failure was silence. There was no alarm bell, no citywide signal, no fire. Horn blasted from towers, no central shouting post, no runners dispatched with formal orders. People screamed only when the flames reached their walls, and by then, others were already fleeing. The message traveled faster than any formal response. Get out. It's coming. The city had grown so vast, so chaotic in its street patterns, that warnings didn't move in time. The hills that once gave Rome beauty now blocked sidelines. By the time one district knew to be afraid, the next was already on fire. And the vigils, the men who were supposed to stop it, were not enough. You might imagine a grand Roman fire brigade, organized, uniformed, trained. That's the myth. In reality, the vigils were a mix of night watchmen, part-time firefighters, and low-paid laborers. There were roughly 7,000 of them to cover a city of over 1 million people. They carried leather buckets, small axes, and some rudimentary pumps. They were divided into cohorts, each covering 2 of the city's 14 regions. But when the fire started near the Circus Maximus, multiple cohorts were too far to respond quickly. Streets were blocked by debris. Crowds were already fleeing. And, even when the vigils did arrive, their tools betrayed them. There were no hydrants, no pressurized systems, no horses trained for emergency maneuvers. Water had to be passed from hand to hand in buckets, often cracked, refilled from wells that were sometimes dry. The bucket chain, that classic symbol of community firefighting, never truly formed. There was no incentive, no coordination, and as panic spread, most men dropped their buckets to carry off their belongings instead. The fire leaped. It didn't move like a candle. It moved like thought, instant, visible, until it was already ahead of you. Rome's narrow alleys and overhanging balconies became fuel corridors. Awnings caught first, then rooftops, then the timber frames of the insulae. Wind whipped sparks into neighboring buildings. Some walls collapsed, spreading embers into storage pits filled with hay or grain or oil jars. Within hours, entire blocks were lost at some point. The vigils gave up on fighting. They shifted to containment. Their new goal wasn't to stop the fire, it was to stop Rome from becoming kindling. So they made the choice history never forgets. They began to destroy homes. Using axes and hooks, they tore down buildings before the fire reached them, creating makeshift fire breaks. But the tools were few, and the wood was dense. Many of the homes were stubborn, especially those with thick oak beams. Others were built so close together that pulling one down meant risking 3 more falling the wrong way. In some cases, attempts to demolish created sparks, flares that then caught onto debris. And worst of all, the fires raged and the firefighting flailed. There was no one leading. No central command post. No Senate delegation issuing orders. No emperor visible in the smoke. No plan beyond instinct. And so, one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world watched itself burn, not because it lacked water, or tools, or manpower, but because it lacked coordination, because its emergency response was built on ceremony, not reality, on assumption, not training, quote, on the myth that Rome could never truly fall victim to something as ordinary as fire. But the fire didn't care about myths, it burned right through them. And the bucket chains, those human links that should have formed, that could have stood between flame and ruin. They never did, and in the smoke-filled air of that choking week, the people of Rome began to wonder if the city could not even defend itself from this. What would happen when a greater threat came? At dawn on the second day, the fire was no longer a surprise. It was a presence, like war or plague, reshaping the city, not with intention, but with momentum. And among the narrow lanes of the Aventine and Palatine districts, the few remaining vigils scrambled through ash-choked alleys, still trying to make sense of their orders. But that was the problem. There were no clear orders. The cohorts vigilum, though praised on imperial scrolls and inscribed on monuments, were little more than a patchwork solution to a massive urban crisis created under Augustus a century before. They were modeled not on firefighters, but on guards, night patrols, tasked with watching for theft, unrest, and the occasional household blaze. They were never meant to fight a catastrophe that swallowed 10 of the city's 14 regions in 6 days. At full strength, each of the 7 cohorts had roughly 1,000 men, but full strength was a fantasy in 64 AD. Turnover was high. Training was minimal. Some men had joined for citizenship, not service. Others were conscripts from poor provinces with little loyalty to the city they now served. Equipment was shared, sometimes broken. Their bases, called execubatoria, were scattered across Rome, but poorly fortified, often no more than a room with leather buckets, a few axes, and a cistern that was likely half dry. The fire, meanwhile, didn't respect boundaries. It didn't care which cohort's region was whose responsibility. Tore through stone walls, leapt across alleys, and burst into private stores where oil and textiles were stacked high. In markets, the flames found beeswax candles. In homes, they found amphorae of olive oil. In shrines, they found wooden altars. And in every corridor of this so-called eternal city, they found one thing in abundance: neglect, even as the smoke darkened the morning sky. There were no horns from the capital, no citywide deployment. The vigils were operating in fragments, some forming human chains, others acting alone, swinging axes into storefronts and praying their demolition would work as a firebreak. But most of them, they were simply overwhelmed. They had no protective gear, no formal hierarchy in action, no emergency drills. Worst of all, they lacked public trust. The citizens panicked when the vigils approached, not out of hope, but out of suspicion. There were rumors, even then, that some of the men were actually spreading the flames, that they carried torches instead of buckets, that they were working under someone's command, someone higher, someone hidden. Many of the vigils denied. Others did not speak at all, because in that chaos, who could say what orders had truly been given? If the emperor's men wanted the city cleared for rebuilding, would it be so hard to believe they had let the fire continue? So, instead of coordination, there was confusion. Instead of firefighting, there was collapse. Buckets were abandoned. Cisterns dried. Some vigil cohorts simply retreated, not out of cowardice, but out of futility. What was there to save when the wind blew sparks faster than they could move? By the third day, new dangers emerged. Looters crept into burned districts, pulling valuables from half-collapsed homes. Rich families hired their own guards to protect what hadn't yet burned. These private forces often clashed with the vigils, accusing them of inaction or worse. Fights broke out. Torches were thrown, tools stolen. What should have been an organized civic response turned into a desperate freefall. The Senate, as always, deliberated too late. They issued orders only once most of the fire had moved north. Proclamations were made, instructing citizens to clear areas around their homes, to destroy unstable roofs, to form bucket lines along major roads. But few had the strength left to comply, and even fewer had homes still standing. By then, the fire had consumed much of what it had come to claim: the Circus Maximus, the great grain warehouses along the Aventine slope, entire neighborhoods of the Subura, the temple of Jupiter Stator, and countless unnamed homes, shops, shrines, the fabric of everyday life in Rome, all reduced to black dust on the breeze. And what lingered in the minds of survivors was not just the loss, but the silence of it all. Where had the alarms been? Where were the leaders? Why had there been no coordinated effort, no gathering of manpower, no intelligent triage? The bucket chains never formed, not because the people were lazy or selfish, but because the city had never taught them how. Rome had grown proud, not prepared. The vigils had been armed with nothing but token tools and grand expectations. Citizens had no drills, no designated shelters, no escape maps, no training. The fire exposed not their weakness, but the lie of their strength. And so the question remained, floating in the smoke like a truth no one could name. What is an empire worth if it cannot protect its own people from itself? When the embers cooled and the sky cleared, Rome was not reborn. It was exhausted. Blackened timbers still jutted from the ground where homes once stood. Walls leaned like tired soldiers. The streets were clogged with ash, rubble, and the quiet movement of survivors looking for anything salvageable: a cracked bowl, a scorched charm, a small bronze coin. Silence had replaced screams. The fires had ended, too, but the city had not resumed breathing. Not yet. And yet, life in Rome had always been about continuation, not necessarily recovery. Soon enough, voices returned to the forum. The Senate reconvened, not to mourn, but to legislate. Nero returned with proclamations of a new vision. Stone would replace timber. Streets would be widened. Fireproofing codes would be enforced. The vigils would be better trained, better housed, better equipped. But these promises arrived like dust in the wind, visible, weightless, and easily ignored, because most citizens knew what had happened. Rome had not merely burned, it had exposed itself. The city's core was not its temples or statues, but its people. And in their moment of greatest need, they had been left to burn, not by flame, but by the failure of systems. Some reforms were indeed implemented. The Domus Publica, Rome's administrative buildings, now included storage for firefighting equipment. Cisterns were built in new plazas. Building codes were updated, requiring the use of brick and stone in many districts. The keys the vigils received, formal barracks, and improved tools. But these changes were small, symbolic. too late for the hundreds of thousands already displaced. The bucket chains that had never formed were now referenced in lectures and writings, examples of what should have happened. Philosophers debated the concept of civic responsibility, and historians like Tacitus recorded the failures with carefully measured disapproval. But no one remembered the names of the men who dropped their buckets and ran. No one remembered the handful who stayed and died with wet feet and scorched hands, trying in vain to stop the tide. No monuments were raised for them. The city honored the idea of resilience, but not the chaos that demanded it. Rome moved on, as it always did, with new statues, new roads, in a new shape, one sculpted not by tradition, but by catastrophe. And in the years that followed, Aurea became a story of Nero, the man who rebuilt, the man who sang, the man who watched the world burn and claimed he could improve it. The failure of the firefighting response, the lack of alarms, the broken water chains, the disorganized vigils was quietly erased from the narrative. In its place rose the myth of design, that perhaps the fire was meant to happen, that out of destruction came beauty, that from failure came innovation. It was a dangerous myth because it made Rome's suffering feel necessary. And if the fire was necessary, then the lack of preparation became not a scandal, but a stepping stone. But for the people who remembered those who had thrown their own water from their own rooftops, who had watched their neighbors scream, who had stumbled barefoot across burning stone, that narrative never sat well. They knew that it wasn't destiny that failed them. It was the absence of readiness, of humility, of leadership. And so Rome marched on, glorified in marble, but cracked beneath it, teaching the world how to build empires without teaching it how to protect them. And buried in that lesson, under the Colosseum, under the Senate's pride, under centuries of retelling, was one final, silent truth, that in the end, it wasn't the fire that ruined Rome. It was the buckets never passed. Asterisk, by the seventh night, after the flames had first erupted near the Circus Maximus, Rome had stopped being afraid of fire. It had moved on to something else entirely. Fear, once bright and burning, had been replaced with bitterness. Questions drifted across the city like smoke that refused to leave. Who had lit the flame? Why had it lasted so long? Why had the city's systems failed? Where had the emperor been when the tenement walls fell? And slowly, subtly, as survivors gathered in gardens and temples, near shrines, or in the half-ruined porticos of former homes, suspicion began to take shape, not as evidence, but as need. The city needed someone to blame. Not something, not fate, not the wind, or the wood, or the negligence of officials. Someone in Rome. The idea of punishment was almost sacred. Crime was expected. Scandal was normal. But blame was ritual. It had to be placed. Hide. It had to be carried. The gods demanded it. And the people, especially those who had lost everything, could not sleep without knowing who had done this to them. And that is when the whispers turned toward a small, strange sect, the Christians. They had no temples, no altars, no sacrifices. They met in private homes, gathered in secret, sang in hushed tones. They worshipped not Jupiter or Mars, not the emperor, not the ancestral gods of Rome, but a crucified man from Judea. They refused to burn incense before Caesar's statue. They spoke of one God, invisible, indivisible, and jealous, too many. Romans, they were simply odd. But now, in the shadow of disaster, odd became dangerous. The rumors began without structure. A merchant's wife, saying she saw a Christian, refused to join a public prayer. A dock worker, recalling how one had spoken of Rome's downfall. A freedman swearing that someone had cursed the city in Greek near the Tiber, just days before the flames. No proof, only patterns of fear, and fear needed to be organized. That's where Nero stepped in. After the fire, Nero's popularity was unstable. Some accounts say he had tried to help, opening the imperial gardens to refugees, arranging for food shipments from nearby cities, but it wasn't enough. The people remembered the delay, the opulence, the construction of his new palace. They remembered the rumors that he had watched the city burn while singing of Troy, that he had wanted the fire to clear land for his Domus Aurea. Whether true or not, Nero understood he needed a distraction, and so he gave the city one. Tacitus, writing decades later, describes how Nero blamed the Christians not for arson directly, but for hatred of the human race. It was an accusation, both vague and all-consuming. What did it mean? Refusing to participate in festivals, not honoring the gods, keeping separate from civic rituals. All of these were seen as offenses, but with the fires, devastation still fresh, they became more than social awkwardness. They became motive, and once the emperor's accusations were public, justice, or something like it, began to unfold. At first, arrests were scattered, small groups taken from poor neighborhoods where Christians often gathered. They were interrogated, tortured, sometimes offered freedom in exchange for names. More were rounded up, more confessions were forced. The network of this quiet religious sect suddenly became a net for Rome's anger. Many broke, some didn't, and those who refused to confess were punished anyway. Executions began quietly, but escalated into spectacle. Crucifixions outside the city gates, public maulings in arenas. Most horrifying were the human torches, Christians tied to poles, covered in pitch and lit ablaze to provide light for Nero's evening garden parties. It was punishment as theater, cruelty disguised as control, and many Romans, even those who had suffered loss in the fire, began to grow uneasy. There was a difference between retribution and pleasure in punishment. Nero's executions seemed to lean into the latter. Even the poet Juvenal, writing years later, mocked the excess of Nero's vengeance. The historian Suetonius noted how Nero's taste for violence became insatiable, how his desire for applause bled into matters of death and spectacle. And yet, most citizens remained quiet, because blame, once given shape, is hard to put back in the box. The Christians were outliers. They didn't defend themselves in public. They didn't write pamphlets or riot in the streets. They accepted their fate as martyrdom. Some even saw it as confirmation of their faith. To suffer as Christ had suffered was a mark of salvation. This made them even stranger in the eyes of Rome. And so, even as the fires died out, and the golden house rose from the ashes, and life returned in uneven breaths to the marketplace and the forum, the smell of burning didn't disappear. It had just changed targets, and centuries later, in quiet halls of Christian memory, that first great persecution, born from a city's need to explain disaster, would become legend, a beginning, a scar. But back in 64 AD, in the ruins of the Aventin, in the temporary shelters beside the Tiber, the question lingered in the air. Did they really do it? Or had Rome, once again, mistaken fear for justice? Asterisk, in the weeks after the fire, Rome's rhythms resumed their outward beat. Markets reopened in makeshift stalls. Families returned to rebuild homes, and temples resumed the hum of prayers to gods who had failed to prevent disaster. But the undercurrent of blame had already found its direction. Nero had named his enemy. And now, the machinery of punishment was moving. Asterisk. The Christians were not a powerful group in 64 AD. They were poor, scattered, and secretive. Most were Jews by origin or association, recent converts from the eastern provinces, people of low standing, no land, and little political protection. Their meetings were misunderstood as conspiracies. Their sacred rites, the breaking of bread, the sharing of wine, were whispered about as cannibalism. Their refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods, and especially to the emperor, made them more than heretics. It made them traitors. Rome did not care whether they had started the fire. It cared that they were different. That was enough. The arrests grew bolder. It began in the Subura district, where Christians had long gathered in cramped tenements. House churches were raided. Scrolls were seized. Men and women were dragged into the street, some for interrogation, others simply for display. The process was informal, chaotic, but increasingly cruel. Neighbors gave names in exchange for leniency. False accusations were folded in with true ones. Entire families disappeared overnight. There were no formal charges of arson in most cases. Instead, accusation remained disturbingly vague. Odium, humani generous hatred of the human race. What did that mean? The Christians refused to participate in public rituals. They would not offer incense to the statue of Nero. They did not celebrate the gods of Rome, did not join in the feasts, did not shout in joy during the imperial processions. Too many Romans, this was social sabotage. They lived among the people, but not with them, a society built on unity and tradition. Their quiet separateness felt like contempt. In the Praetorian Castra, the imperial barracks that served as a temporary prison, the Christians were lined up in rows, some bound in chains, others starved and sleep-deprived. Questioning took the form of torture. Those who denied their faith were sometimes released, but others, even under pain, refused. They sang hymns as their fingernails were torn. They whispered prayers through broken teeth. They greeted death not with fear, but with stillness that disturbed even their executioners. It is said that some Roman guards began to question the morality of their orders, not because they doubted Nero, but because their victims did not behave like criminals. And still, the executions continued. Public spectacle had always been part of Roman justice, but this was different. The scale, the cruelty, cued the almost performative quality of the punishments. All of it felt less like law and more like vengeance on behalf of an emperor's damaged pride. Nero hosted garden parties in the Horti Maezonitis, his private pleasure grounds. There, among the trimmed hedges and marble fountains, Christians were tied to posts and coated in pitch. At dusk, they were lit, not metaphorically, but literally, to illuminate Nero's banquets. As guests dined on roasted boar and drank from crystal goblets, the screams of burning bodies provided a grotesque kind of entertainment. The people, at first curious, then thrilled, began to murmur. Even the bloodthirsty crowds of the amphitheater, used to lions and gladiators in public executions, began to shift in their seats. This was too much. This was not punishment. It was indulgence. And worse, it was an indulgence cloaked in righteousness. The same man who built a golden house on the ashes of his city now lit his garden with the bodies of scapegoats. Some senators turned away in private shame. Some philosophers, especially the Stoics, recorded their horror in journals that would not be published until years later. Others remained silent, because to speak against Nero now was to risk becoming next. And so the Christians, those who survived, faded underground. They buried their dead in unmarked graves. They wrote letters to one another, not of rage, but of endurance, of faith, of silence. They held their gatherings even more secretly than before, often beneath the city in crypts and tunnels that would later become the catacombs. And slowly, their stories shifted. They were no longer just a strange sect from Judea. They were martyrs. They were proof that Rome's power could not kill every soul it tried to crush. And for those Romans who still remembered the fires, the loss, the chaos, the question deepened. If these people were truly enemies of the human race, why did they suffer like saints? Astra's time passed, but not enough to heal. Rome rebuilt, though unevenly. The poor districts remained charred and half-cleared, replaced by nothing. The hills echoed with the sounds of hammers and chisels. But those Sounds came mostly from the Domus, Aurea, Nero's glittering monument to himself. Meanwhile, a quieter transformation was taking root far beneath the marble colonnades and perfumed fountains. Fear was being rewritten into memory, and memory into something even more durable. Belief, for the Christians, persecution of 64 AD would become a defining moment. But at the time, this was simply trauma. The survivors were not yet saints. Their stories were not yet written in gold leaf on illuminated scrolls. They were simply outcasts, dazed, scattered, and still in hiding. Families lived underground in storage rooms, in sewers, or in the unfinished crypts beneath older Roman buildings. Some had lost everything. Others had lost everyone. A husband disappeared during a raid. A sister never returned from the forum. A child taken during a public prayer, never seen again. And yet, they did not disappear. They adapted. They carved fish symbols, ichthys, into stone walls as secret signs of solidarity. They greeted one another in coded phrases. They sang their hymns softly enough not to echo. Some returned to their trades. In the marketplace, selling bread or fabric under false names. Others wandered the ruins of their former homes and buried small scraps of parchment wrapped in cloth, fragments of teachings, words of Jesus, letters from Paul, things too dangerous to carry, but too sacred to burn. Rome did not notice. The city, as always, moved on. New distractions came, a scandal here, a rebellion there. Nero's popularity swung wildly. New enemies arose. The Senate grew bolder. But the fire and the persecution that followed became something awkward, unspoken. The spectacle had soured. The public appetite for cruelty had shifted into discomfort. And Nero, he never apologized. He never admitted the persecution may have gone too far. In his mind, he had quelled unrest, controlled suspicion, reclaimed his image. But it hadn't worked. The Christians, though fewer in number, had grown more visible in absence. Their silence became its own kind of defiance. Their suffering, especially that of the innocent, began to erode the official story. By the time of Nero's death, just 4 years later, the Christian community in Rome had not been extinguished. It had scattered, rooted itself deeper, and waited. What had been a small, localized sect was now a symbol of endurance. Even some pagan observers, disturbed by the intensity of the punishments, began to question the wisdom of scapegoating a group whose only crime seemed to be worshiping differently. The historian Tacitus, writing years later, would include the account of Nero's persecution in his annals, not to praise it, but to criticize it. He noted that even those who detested the Christians pitied them for the grotesque punishments they endured. It was, in many ways, Rome's quiet admission of guilt, not in courts, not in proclamations, but in the shifting of public memory. Still, the official records did not acknowledge mistakes. The imperial archives remained unchanged. The Christians were not cleared. The edicts were not rescinded. There was no trial to examine the truth of their supposed crimes. Rome preferred things neat. The fire had needed a cause. Nero had provided one. That was the version written in ink, but the version written in pain remained elsewhere. It remained in the stories passed down from mother to child, darkened rooms, in the songs whispered in hidden houses, in the oil lamps lit beside the bones of those who died not for rebellion, but for belief. And the irony of it all, the fire that destroyed much of Rome, a fire that the city blamed on the Christians, would ultimately give birth to a flame that never went out in time. A Christian faith would grow, not in spite of Rome's persecution, but because of it. The memory of suffering became a kind of sermon. The names of those burned in Nero's garden would later be remembered as martyrs, revered, etched into stone. Their deaths became proof of conviction. And as the empire turned inward in the coming decades, torn by corruption and military chaos, the memory of the fire remained in the background, a slow-burning truth that sometimes the easiest targets reveal the deepest failings, and when a city as mighty as Rome must turn to the innocent for blame, perhaps it's not the accused who stand condemned in history. Asterisk. Rome is remembered in marble. That's the image carried through time. White columns, stone temples, amphitheaters, carved into the hills like the fingerprints of the gods. But this is not the Rome that burned, the Rome of 64 AD. The Rome that vanished in flame was mostly built of wood, timber, and plaster, straw and reed, resin-sealed boards and tarred beams. It was not a city of monuments, but a city of fire waiting for its moment. Because while the temples, forums, and basilicas dazzled foreign ambassadors and visiting nobles, those buildings were few. The truth of Rome was in its side streets, a vast sprawl of insulae, shops, food stalls, bathhouses, and workshops, all crowded into districts that no city planner had ever touched. There were no grids, no symmetry, no precautions, just buildings on top of buildings, and almost all of them could burn. It began with the materials. Rome had grown faster than it could afford to, and timber was cheap. Construction crews used pine from Etruria, cypress from the south, and even scrapped wood from dismantled ships when they could find it. The planks were layered with straw or clay to keep out the wind, but these did nothing to resist heat. Roofs were often thatched with dried reeds or wooden shingles. Excellent insulation, and even better, fuel-dot walls, too, were frequently plaster over wood frames, not stone. A well-made insula might have brick or volcanic tuff on its outer levels, but its core remained wooden. Support beams creaked with age, and floors were often built too thin, too light, to carry more than a modest load. And yet, insulae climbed high, some as tall as 6 or 7 stories, haphazardly stacked like towers of kindling, with balconies that nearly touched across the narrow streets. The design was not just flammable, it was fatal. Cooking fires were lit inside, often on portable braziers. Oil lamps were left burning overnight. Soot-coated ceilings, chimneys were rare. Sparks traveled freely from window to curtain, from curtain to bed straw, from bed straw to ceiling beam. One mistake, one dropped ember, one gust through a cracked window was enough, and the city was full of sparks. Markets burned oil for lamps. Bakers ran their ovens long after dusk. Blacksmiths pounded hot metal beside splintering barrels. In the summer heat, Rome became a dried field, and its people lit it daily, hoping the wind wouldn't change. Even the layout of Rome betrayed its vulnerability. The city was built around 7 hills, with districts folding into valleys between them. Streets wound in tight spirals or jagged slants, curving around shrines, villas, and ancient foundations. Dead ends were common. Alleys were sometimes no wider than a man's shoulders. Courtyards were often enclosed with one exit, and stairwells in insulae were steep, narrow, and slippery from where, in emergencies, escape was almost impossible. And then there were the overhangs. Wooden balconies jutted into the streets, so close that neighbors could pass bread from one window to another. Laundry was strung across alleys. Awnings stretched from building to building. It's created shaded lanes, cooler in summer, but they also allowed fire to jump. Once an upper floor caught, the flames could spread horizontally as easily as upward. The Subura district, one of the hardest hit in the fire of 64, was notorious for this, packed with tenements and known for its noise, filth, and poverty. It was also one of the most densely built regions of the city. Its winding roads were lined with shops at ground level and rooms above, often housing entire families in a single space, and every one of those rooms had a lamp. Rome's regulations at the time were minimal. Augustus had once attempted fire codes, limits on height, spacing, and materials, but enforcement was weak. Corruption was common. Builders paid bribes to ignore height restrictions. Safety features were skipped to cut costs. The city grew not under guidance, but under pressure from population, from trade, from politics. The vigils, Rome's firefighting force, did what they could, but they were outnumbered, equipped, outmatched, and always too late. Most citizens knew the danger. Fire was a constant threat, but there was no collective memory of catastrophe. No great fire yet, only little ones, quickly contained, quickly forgotten. Rome lived close to the edge because it had not yet fallen until it did. The fire that began near the Circus Maximus on July 18th did not invent destruction. It simply revealed how much tinder the city had built for itself, and as it spread through markets, insulae, courtyards, in forums, there was a terrible realization rising alongside the smoke, that this wasn't just a fire. This was the inevitable. Rome had been built to burn. Asterisk in the days before the fire. If you stood atop the Aventine Hill and looked north toward the Forum, you would see a city packed tighter than a grain silo before harvest. Rooftops overlapped, alleys disappeared under layers of awnings, carts choked narrow streets in lines so dense they hardly moved. The city looked alive, vibrant, powerful, humming, but it wasn't breathing, not in any real way. There were no fire breaks, no large open spaces in the poorer regions, no strategic plazas designed to interrupt disaster. Temples and theaters offered some gaps, but these were scattered and often closed off at night. Most neighborhoods, especially in the Subura and Esquiline districts, were labyrinths, places built not with foresight, but with improvisation. Each new building answered only one question: can we fit it here? Never. Should we? Rome, in its heart, had become a closed box, and inside that box was air, dry, still air. In the summer months, Rome baked under the Mediterranean sun. The insulae trapped heat during the day and released it at night, making evenings even warmer than afternoons. The plaster cracked, the thatched roofs curled, and the timber beneath dried until it sounded hollow when knocked. People cooked indoors, often in close quarters, left braziers glowing overnight for warmth or to reheat morning meals. All of this added up to a fact everyone understood, but no one truly believed. The city was one match away from ruin. But the systems meant to guard against that, the vigils, the water infrastructure, the building codes, existed more on paper than in practice. Take water. For example, Rome was famous for its aqueducts, marvels of engineering that fed the city's public fountains, baths, and elite homes. But when it came to firefighting, these marvels were less useful than you might expect. The water was not pressurized. It flowed by gravity in only two fixed points. If a fire broke out in a place far from a fountain or cistern, the vigils had to rely on buckets, leather sacks passed hand to hand. There were no fire wagons, no pump carts, no emergency valves to flood burning streets, and the cisterns themselves. Many were dry by summer's peak, used constantly, seldom cleaned, often forgotten in richer districts. Homes had private wells, but in places like the Subura, access to water during a fire meant hoping that the local fountain wasn't dry or blocked by stampeding crowds. Then there were the streets. Rome's oldest roads were laid when it was still a small town. As the city expanded, new buildings followed the lines of old property boundaries. Alleys appeared between shops, not by plan, but by accident. Some neighborhoods had no main road at all, just paths that twisted between homes like veins, each one too narrow for a cart, many too narrow even for two people walking side by side. This made firefighting impossible. You couldn't bring in water, and you couldn't evacuate. In many cases, the flames moved faster than the people, and above all this hung the culture of tolerance. Rome had normalized risk. The people lived with the smell of smoke as a background scent. A minor fire was just another night. If a neighbor's insula collapsed from age or negligence, the crowd gathered, murmured, and moved on. Landlords simply rebuilt with the same materials. There was no consequence, no memory. Each generation assumed someone else would handle it, but no one ever did. And so, when the Great Fire began, it was not a surprise that it spread. It was a surprise that it hadn't happened sooner. Within hours of the first flare, catching the wooden awnings of the Circus Maximus, the fire had reached nearby taverns, warehouses, and homes. It moved, not in straight lines, but in pulses, jumping streets, circling walls, devouring staircases before residents even woke up. Smoke filled homes before heat did. People died not in flames, but in confusion. Some ran into alleyways that lead nowhere. Others tried to climb down crumbling stairs. The lucky ones reached the Tiber. The rest became shadows in the walls. Rome's wooden heart, hidden beneath plaster and ambition, was now exposed, and no one could stop it. The city had forgotten to breathe, and now it was choking on its own design. Asterisk. When the fires finally died, Rome was quiet. Too quiet. The hissing of embers had faded. The smoke had lifted, and yet the stillness that followed did not feel like peace. Kate, it felt like a question no one knew how to answer. What had really been lost? It wasn't just buildings. It wasn't even lives, though thousands were likely gone, many without names. What Rome had lost was its illusion. The illusion that greatness made it safe, that laws and gods and emperors were enough to protect a city made of flammable pride. But what followed was not transformation. What followed was a return to the same mistakes. Nero, seeking to calm the people and restore confidence, issued new building regulations. For the first time in recorded Roman history, he set strict guidelines for materials, street widths, and building heights. He outlawed the use of timber for external walls. He demanded that homes be constructed with fire-resistant materials like brick and stone. He ordered that walls should not touch, that courtyards should remain open, that cisterns be dug near clusters of homes. And for a brief moment, hope flickered. It seemed Rome might finally learn, but the reality was more complicated. Stone was expensive, brick even more so, and many of the poor. The vast majority of Rome's population could not afford to build to code. So they did what they had always done. They built quickly, quietly, and illegally. Back alleys reappeared. Timber returned to rooftops. Thatched awnings stretched across the newer, wider roads. And while the city rebuilt its facade with stone and stucco, its veins, the back streets and hidden quarters, once again filled with dry, brittle dreams. Landlords skirted regulations by claiming their new buildings were temporary. Builders reused blackened beams salvaged from the fire. Upper floors were added illegally. The city inspectors, underpaid and easily bribed, looked the other way. Rome's population kept growing, and so did demand for housing. Every regulation was eventually softened by desperation. Even the vigils, supposedly reformed and re-equipped, struggled to maintain vigilance. New tools were promised, new training implemented, but without consistent funding or political will, the improvements stalled. Barracks received paint before equipment. Cisterns were dug but not maintained. And while some elite neighborhoods saw stone reconstruction, the hills of the Aventine and the valleys near the Esquiline returned to their old ways. Timber, oil lamps, curtains too close to stoves. Rome had become a city that burned, mourned, promised, and then forgot. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, because unlike cities lost to war, a volcano, or flood, Rome had burned from the inside, from choices, from negligence, from the refusal to see that prestige was not the same. as protection in time. Later, emperors would build grander monuments. The Colosseum would rise from the drained lake of Nero's golden dream. New temples would glitter in the sun. Marble forms would stretch in proud defiance of the past. But the people still cooked in wooden kitchens, still slept beside open flames, still lived in structures barely held together by habit, and plastered out Rome would burn again. Not always so grandly, not always so completely, but often, because it had never truly changed. It had only layered new stone over old timber, and in the end, you have to wonder if a city keeps rebuilding the same firewood. Was it ever trying to stop the flames? Asterisk, as the fire devoured Rome, moving street by street like a starving animal. Not everyone ran in the same direction. Most citizens ran toward the river, away from the hills, away from the heat and falling buildings. They ran with bundles, with children, with whatever they could lift in their arms. But others, the privileged, the titled, the connected, moved not downward, but upward, toward the imperial gardens atop the Palatine and Esquiline hills, where the heat thinned and the roads widened. Emperor Nero ordered that his personal gardens, the Horti Maiani, later expanded into the Horti Luculliani and Horti Maecenatus, be opened to shelter those displaced by the fire. It was, by many accounts, a noble gesture. But not everyone was welcome. The emperor's message was not broadcast with horns or criers. It moved quietly, as many elite orders did, through messengers, attendants, and those already in favor. Patrons told clients. Freedmen passed the word along. Senators ensured their relatives had space before others arrived. And by the time ordinary citizens reached the gates, many were told, "It is full." Behind the hedges, away from the smoke and soot, the lucky few found something strange. Stillness. Teal gardens were vast, lush, and meticulously kept. Floral hedges trimmed weekly. Cypress trees towering over shaded walkways. Sculpted fountains, some still trickling with clean water. Marble benches, soft grass, the scent of rosemary. For a few nights, it became a kind of alternate Rome, untouched, protected, green, and those who sheltered their senators, merchants, aristocrats, favorite artists, lived in a surreal in-between. They could hear the city burning. They could see the sky, orange at midnight. Some even saw refugees crowding near the walls, faces lit by flames, pleading to be let in. But they did not open the gates, because those gates were guarded by imperial slaves, by private soldiers, by loyalty. And so, the gardens became not only a sanctuary, but a boundary, a symbol of Rome's deep division. Inside, wine, food, shade, safety. Outside, smoke, ash, chaos. One senator's wife wrote later, in a letter preserved only in fragments, "We ate figs beneath the vine pergola and watched the sky flicker red." It felt like the gods had turned the world upside down, and only this patch of grass remained unjudged. Others told no stories. They knew better, because the comfort they received came at a cost. The knowledge that they had survived by distance, not merit. That their escape had come not from courage, but from invitation. And Nero. He walked the paths of his garden during those nights, sometimes alone, sometimes with musicians, quietly observing the fire from afar. Some sources claim he wept. Others say he whispered lines from Homer. Still others insist he barely spoke at all, only paused now and then to listen and nod. But what mattered more than his words was his presence, because the people gathered there watched him, not just as their emperor, but as a man untouched, unflinching, clean-robed, standing amid fountains while 10 districts crumbled below. He said little about the fire and less about the people, and when one minor official asked what would be done after the flames were gone, Nero is said to have replied, "Then we will begin." The fire raged for 9 days, but inside the gardens, the air remained cool. The shade of tall pines filtered the smoke, and the carefully terraced paths of the imperial estates kept the worst of the heat at bay. Servants watered the soil, not to nourish plants, but to keep the dust from rising. Slaves carried pitchers of water to the inner groves. Nisans, those allowed past the stone gates, lounged in silk cloaks and tried not to look toward the glowing sky. Some were senators, others the wives and daughters of magistrates. A few were well-known artists, castellans, and musicians, handpicked by the emperor's household to be preserved. This was not a public refuge. It was a curated retreat, cool, while thousands of ordinary citizens lay on the hard banks of the Tiber, wrapped in blankets of soot. The chosen few sipped watered wine in the emperor's shade. They whispered their condolences to one another, spoke of property lost, galleries collapsed, plans postponed, and then fell quiet, because some of them deep down knew they were not meant to be safe. They were just close to power and proximity. In Rome had always been more valuable than virtue among those who wandered the garden paths. During those nights were men who had spoken only days earlier about civic duty, about Rome's strength, about resilience. But when the flames rose, their titles did not shield their homes. Their marble statues shattered like everyone else's. Their libraries burned. Their kitchens exploded in smoke. What saved them was not status, it was access. The gates of the Horde were not flung open to all. They opened selectively, based on messengers, tokens, and names. If you had once pleased the emperor, you were remembered. If you had once dined in the golden halls of the Palatine, your face was not forgotten. And if you had done nothing but remain quiet, obedient, agreeable, then perhaps someone whispered your name into the right ear. The result, a sanctuary that bore no resemblance to the rest of Rome. In the outer districts, families huddled in alleys with wet rags over their mouths. Here blocks of refugees walked barefoot over ash, clutching infants and jugs. But inside the gardens, the floor was swept. Tables were set. Nero had ordered that no food be wasted, no music silenced. Lutes played in the evening. Gardeners clipped roses by torchlight. Some who sheltered there tried to resist the comfort. They asked, "What can we do? Can we send food? Can we make room?" But they were always answered with polite refusal. Security, they were told, required stillness. Outside help would invite chaos. Inside, order must be preserved. And so the rich stayed where they were, some with guilt, some with relief, most with quiet resignation. They played at grief while wrapped in privilege. And each night, as the fire turned the Roman sky into a soft orange veil, they told themselves the same story. We would help if we could, but not now. Not yet. Nero, walking the garden paths, did little to change this asterisk. He appeared at intervals, surrounded by attendants, dressed not in purple robes of mourning, but in soft whites and pale blues. He made small talk. He complimented a poet. He inquired about a senator's injured wife, and then he would pause, turn toward the horizon, and stare at the distant plumes of smoke rising from what had once been the Subura dot. To some, he looked reflective. To others, pleased. There is no record of Nero offering prayers to the gods during those garden nights. No sacrifices at the household shrines. No great addresses of unity to the city. His silence hung over the gardens like a canopy shielding, but heavy. And though he offered the space as refuge, there was an unspoken rule among those gathered. You did not question the emperor in his own sanctuary. So the rich ate. They slept on cushions brought from burned villas. They recited lines from Virgil to pass the time. They told themselves their presence here was only temporary, and far below, in the blackened maze of Rome's forgotten neighborhoods, The fire moved steadily through homes that had never been near a garden. Asterisk, when the fire at last burned itself out, when even the embers seemed to sigh and sink into Rome's dusty bones, the survivors emerged like shadows from a dream. And yet, those who stepped out of Nero's imperial gardens did not do so as saviors or even witnesses. They stepped out quietly, returning to homes that no longer stood, to neighborhoods they barely knew, to streets filled not with welcome, but with eyes, because outside those gates, everyone else had suffered, and they remembered who had not. The imperial gardens, lush and orderly, had become a symbol not of charity, but of distance. In a city where so many had slept under broken columns and washed their children in the Tiber, the thought that fountains had still flowed just uphill became a kind of poison in the mind. Whispers followed those who had taken shelter under the cypress trees. Not accusations, at least not openly. Just silence, unspoken questions, glances that lasted too long. Were you in the gardens? Did you see him? How far from the flames were you really? The men and women who had passed, those nights in safety, tried to resume their lives. But everything had shifted. Their neighbors no longer greeted them with nods. Their clients arrived less frequently. Their names, once said with admiration, now passed between lips in lowered tones, because survival in Rome was not always a virtue. It was often a suspicion, especially when it came wrapped in perfume and pale linen. Nero, too, understood this, perhaps not immediately, but soon. He began to avoid mention of the gardens. He turned his attention to rebuilding, to grand designs, to his Domus, Aurea. He gave speeches about Rome's future, not its scars. He talked of wide streets and stone homes, of a city reborn from fire. But he said nothing of those who had watched it all from behind hedges. The gardens were trimmed quietly. The musicians were sent home. The soft couches and trays of fruit disappeared. And those who had once laughed under Nero's laurel trees, now left by side paths, turning to estates in the countryside, or seeking comfort in anonymity. They had been protected, but they had not been forgotten. Some tried to repay the debt. They funded grain distributions, donated to public rebuilding efforts, sponsored small shrines for the dead. But it wasn't enough to erase the memory. A temple made of marble could not cover a silence made of fear. And so, over the months, the gardens emptied. What had once been a sanctuary now felt watched. Even the plants seemed quieter. The fountains, slower, the hedges grew taller, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. The birds stopped singing at dusk. Became a place of pause, not peace. The poor did not speak of it. They had no time for such things. But they remembered. They remembered how the sky had glowed, how the gates had stayed shut, how some had stayed clean, while others clawed through ash. The gardens would remain for years, of course, landscaped, admired, expanded by later emperors. They would host philosophers and poets, lovers and spies. But the memory of that summer of who fled, who watched, and who stayed behind never quite left the soil. Because Rome, for all its monuments and marble, never forgot who was inside the gates when the world turned to smoke. And it never fully forgave. So now, if you walk the Palatine Hill where Nero's gardens once flourished, if you stand in the spot where senators once lounged as Rome cracked, below them you might still feel the weight of that quiet. Not guilt, not even grief, just the heavy stillness of a question never answered. In the moment when everything burned, did they really believe they deserved to be spared? Asterisk, the fire was gone, but the Subura still smoked. Long after the flames had retreated into memory, the narrow alleyways of Rome's poorest and most densely packed district remained blackened, silent, and broken. What had once been a churning maze of taverns, brothels, tenements, bathhouses, and food stalls now resembled the aftermath of a forgotten war. There were no bodies in the streets anymore. Most had been cleared, buried without ceremony in communal pits or burned where they fell. But you could still smell them, or perhaps it was just the memory of them, tangled in the soot that clung to every stone and bone. Survivors walked through the ruins without speaking, their hands tucked inside sleeves, not out of modesty, but to keep them warm, even in summer. Because when the Subura burned, it didn't just lose homes, it lost warmth, it lost noise, it lost the wild, messy, human rhythm that had once made it the most alive corner of the Roman Empire. Now, it was silent, or nearly. Here and there, families returned to what had once been theirs. A pot half melted into the stones, a wall still standing, a familiar corner where a dog used to sleep. They came not to rebuild, not yet, but to remember, to salvage, to see whether the world that had shaped them was truly gone. They walked barefoot through ash, stepping over collapsed stairways, splintered beams, broken tiles. Children picked through the debris, looking for coins or glass beads. Women brushed away soot with their sleeves, revealing nothing more than empty doorframes. Men stared at the sky through holes that had once been roofs. The Subura had burned deeper than the city realized. It had burned in layers, top to bottom, inside out. Most of its buildings had been wooden insulae, packed so tightly together that they shared warmth in the winter and fires in the summer. And now, with no walls, no crowds, no markets, the district felt exposed, as though someone had peeled back the skin of the city and left it raw. And yet, even here, life tried to return. A tavern keeper laid a cloth on a cracked table. An old woman drew water from a well that had miraculously survived. Two boys tried to sweep a section of alleyway clear. Not because it mattered, but because they remembered that someone once did. There was no order to the recovery. The Senate had offered no real plan for the poor. Nero's officials focused on stone streets and broad avenues. But the Subura had always been a place they preferred to forget, a place of noise, crime, pleasure, and poverty. Now it was gone, and some called that progress. But those who had lived there knew better. They knew it was not just a slum. It was a city within a city, and now it was hollow. The only help came from one another. Neighbors shared food pulled from hidden caches. A widow invited 3 orphans to sleep beside her, under a salvaged sheet hung between 2 blackened doorposts. Bread was baked in a broken clay oven, still standing near the old bathhouse ruins. And stories, more than anything, kept the Subura alive. Stories of how the fire came like a whisper, of how the walls lit up before anyone knew, of how a mother had passed her child through a second-story window to a stranger, of how someone, no one knew who, had knocked on every door on Vico Jugario, saving dozens before the roof gave in. There was no hero statue, no poet wandered the alleys reciting elegies, but the survivors remembered. They held their memories like coins, not valuable in weight, but in meaning. Proof that they had been there, that they had mattered. And for many, that was enough to stay. Even when officials discouraged it, even when new laws made rebuilding harder, even when they were told it would be better to leave, they stayed because this had been their Rome, not the Rome of columns and emperors, but of spilled wine, laundry lines, shouting vendors, crying babies, and Bacali gossip. And they believed that, somehow, even this could return. If not as it was, then as something close. And so they began. Not with stone or marble, but with cloth, rope, wood, whatever they could find. A plank became a bench, a curtain, a wall, a pot, still warm from fire, became a hearth again. And as dusk fell on the Subura, the first evening without smoke in over a week, someone lit a lamp and set it on the steps of a home that no longer stood. In that light, small and flickering, stayed through the night. Asterisk. The reconstruction of Rome happened in marble, but the reconstruction of the Subura happened in mud. While Nero sketched dreams of gold-plated halls and wide avenues drawn from a poet's imagination, the survivors of the Subura returned to the simplest materials they could find: scavenged wood, broken brick, thatch pulled from collapsed roofs, and nails straightened by hand over makeshift hearts. They built not to impress. They built to exist. Rome, after the fire, did not wait for permission to judge the Subura. Many officials considered the district a relic of the past, a filthy, unstable, overcrowded corner of the city that had deserved to burn. They believed its end had been a kind of blessing in disguise. Now the government could redesign Rome without it. Widen the roads, teamed the hills, remove the people who had always been too noisy, too poor, too unrefined for the imperial image. But the people of the Subura hadn't asked to be erased. They simply wanted to go home. And so, piece by piece, they did. They cleared the alleys, not with wheelbarrows, but with bare hands. They dug out rooms from the ash, used beams from fallen temples to prop up roofs. Walls were not measured, they were remembered. Where the bread stall had been, this corner was where Tiberius, the barber, used to joke about every man's bad hair. That sloping arch had once shaded the fortune-teller's cat. Nothing was official, nothing was legal, but every plank, every stone, every rag stretched between two posts said the same thing: we're still here. There were no engineers guiding them, no architects, no marble shipments, but there was memory, and that was more powerful than permission. And the Subura needed memory, because Rome refused to give it dignity. The Senate records barely mentioned the neighborhood in their scrolls of recovery. No plaques were placed, no shrines erected. No public mourning was held. It was as though the Subura had always been an inconvenience, and now that it had suffered most, the city was glad to pretend it had never existed. But the survivors didn't need recognition to rebuild their world. They needed each other. Women who had never spoken before the fire now shared cooking pots. Widowed mothers formed small communes to watch each other's children while they foraged or worked. Elderly men, long considered useless, became valued again. Their memories of building codes and local terrain were suddenly precious. They remembered which stones had collapsed before, which corners flooded when it rained, which beams had held during the fire. Children, too, became architects of their own survival. They learned to climb over rubble in silence. They discovered which bricks were still warm, which rooftops had gaps, which animals had returned first. Cats, always the first to return to a scarred place, walked the ruins like sentinels. Birds nested in cracks left by fire. Even lizards, thin and fast, reappeared to sun themselves on the rubble. The Subura began to breathe again, but not like it had before. Now, every movement was slower. Every meal was thinner. Every laugh felt like a rebellion. The people did not forget what had happened, and they did not forgive. They spoke of the fire, not in rage, but in repetition, as if saying it aloud, kept it real, kept it from being reshaped by the polished tongues of the elite. They say it started near the circus. They say the emperor watched it burn. They say we weren't supposed to return, but here we are. Sometimes, at night, they would gather in what had once been a public square, now just a clearing with a few stones in a circle. Someone would play a lyre. Someone would pass a jug of watered wine. A child might recite a line of poetry remembered from school, and an elder would correct it gently, as if nothing had changed. And in these moments, Subura became more than a ruin. It became a memory that fought back, because while Nero built a city of stone, these people rebuilt a city of stories. They told each other who had run back into the flames to save a neighbor, who had carried an old woman on his back, who had stood watch while others slept, who had pulled 3 screaming children from a collapsing staircase. Their statues weren't carved, but their names were known, and as Rome polished its image and buried its mistakes under marble and gold, the Subura whispered a different truth beneath it all, that the soul of the city had not been in its temples. It had been in the alleys, in the kitchens that fed 10 people from one pot, in the shopkeeper who let a child take bread without coin, in the washerwoman who used her own water to clean someone else's wounds. And even now, with no roofs overhead, that spirit hadn't gone anywhere. It was sitting in the rubble, waiting for the world to notice. Asterisk, the official maps of Rome never truly captured the Subura. Cartographers drew clean lines and labeled temples, forums, triumphal arches, and aqueducts, the architecture of empire. The Subura had always been an in-between place, a neighborhood defined not by monuments, but by motion. Its streets curled like smoke. Its names came from the mouths of neighbors, not from the pens of bureaucrats. And after the fire, even those names began to fade. Writings from the Senate avoided the district entirely. Rebuilding plans passed over it. Funding was assigned to major roads and elite quarters. The Palatine rose again in stone. The Campus Martis gleamed in its new renovations. But the Subura remained missing, a smudge on the city's parchment soul, and yet it lived, not as it had before. Not fully, but it lived in stubborn, tireless pieces. A boy named Felix reopened his father's bread stall, though he had only 1 brick oven and no roof. A woman named Livia rebuilt her wine shop using scavenged beams and leftover clay pots, selling weak mixtures to tired men who needed to forget for a few hours. A group of orphans turned a half-collapsed temple porch into a home, sleeping beneath the stars and waking with the sun. There was no ceremony, no triumph, but slowly, day by day, the Subura returned. The laughter came back first, quiet at first, behind hands, behind curtains, then louder, the way it had always been. Darkers began to call out prices again. Musicians plucked at strings. Someone hammered a nail with rhythm, and someone else followed with a whistle. The ash was never fully swept away. Even months later, still clung to the stone, a reminder of what had passed. But the people did not try to forget. They couldn't forget, because forgetting meant accepting that the world had moved on without them, and it hadn't. Not really. The same roads still led to the forum. The same markets still opened at dawn. The same arguments still echoed through the walls. Even the fire, tant in its hunger, had failed to take the heart of the Subura, because that heart had never lived in its sea, its buildings. It had lived in the people, in the man who saved a piece of burnt wood to mark where his wife's bed once stood, in the girl who found a coin melted into stone and kept it as a lucky charm, in the old man who, every morning, poured out a small libation onto the ashes, not for the gods, but for the neighbors who never came back. And perhaps, in a way, the rest of Rome couldn't understand. The fire had clarified something. The elite rebuilt in marble to show the world their strength. The poor rebuilt in ash to show the world their memory. And memory was harder to erase, because memory had names, faces, smells. It had the sound of children running down alleys, the ache of laughter after hunger, the quiet dignity of sweeping a ruined doorstep as if guests might still arrive. One woman, her name was Callista, painted flowers on the side of her home using pigments made from crushed berries and ash. When asked why, she said only, because this is still my street. No monument ever honored her. No historian recorded her words. But the petals remained, faded but there. And decades later, when the Subura once again grew crowded, noisy, and full of life. No one remembered the fire the way the Senate did as a crisis, a symbol, or a political problem. They remembered it simply as the time everything fell, and some of us stood back up. That was the true rebuilding, not inroads or laws, but in the refusal to disappear. Because even if Rome forgot the Subura never forgot Rome. Asterisk in the weeks following the fire. Rome was not a city. It was an idea, charred, fractured, waiting to be rewritten. And Nero had a pen in his hand. He had watched the city burn from a hilltop, surrounded by attendants and shade. He had walked his gardens while smoke curled over rooftops. And now, with entire districts leveled and the wails of the poor fading into background noise, the emperor saw something others could not. He saw a blank slate. To many, the fire had been a disaster. To Nero, it was a starting point, not just for repairs, not even for rebuilding, but for reinvention. Rome, he declared, would rise again, wider, cleaner, more beautiful. An urban poem of symmetry and safety carved from suffering. It began with decrees. Walls must be built from fireproof materials. No more timber facades or straw insulation. Streets must be widened to allow the passage of carts and air. Homes must have their own courtyards to act as fire breaks. Water reservoirs must be installed in every district, no longer just near temples and public fountains. It sounded like progress, but progress in Rome always came with a cost. The elite embraced the vision first. Senators, landowners, and those who had long grumbled about the cluttered chaos of the old city now saw opportunity. Property was cheap in the ruined zones. Families who had fled and not returned forfeited their claims. Nero's agents quietly facilitated the transfer of land to those willing to build according to his vision, often at a discount, always with influence. And for Nero's architects, the city became a canvas. Lucius Adruinus, one of the lead planners, appointed by the imperial household, was tasked with reimagining several key districts. He sketched new forums, introduced boulevards inspired by Greek cities, proposed sightlines that aligned temples with sunset. The plans were ambitious. Some said impossible. But they had one thing other Roman projects rarely had: imperial backing. Stone and marble poured in from the provinces. Bricklayers worked day and night. Sculptors carved friezes with double meanings, symbols of rebirth, yes, but also subtle nods to Nero himself. One wall relief showed a phoenix rising from flames. Another showed Apollo, the god of light and music, striking down chaos. It was not lost on anyone who the emperor imagined himself to be. But outside the construction zones, not everyone was convinced. The poor, many still sleeping in tents or makeshift lean-tos on the edge of the Esquiline, watched these projects unfold with weary eyes. They were not invited to the rebuilding. Their homes had been lost, their claims erased. And now their neighborhoods were being replaced by palaces and pleasure gardens. Worse, the new building codes were nearly impossible for them to follow. Brick was expensive. Stone, even more so. Permits were slow to process and often required bribes. Many found their applications rejected for non-compliance without explanation. Others were told their plots had been absorbed into a public space or reassigned to a senator's cousin, and so they faded into the background. Not gone, just invisible, living in the hills, under bridges, and courtyards of unfinished villas. Meanwhile, Nero gave speeches. He spoke of destiny, of transformation, of a Rome no longer defined by its temples, but by its vision. He described a city of light, not the golden light of the old gods, but a radiance born from design, from order, from imperial will. In private, he reviewed models made of wax and clay, tiny cities spread out on wide tables. He asked about column, height, and shade angles. He changed portico colors, and adjusted fountain placements. He did not weep for the Subura or visit the refugee camps. His grief had always been architectural, not personal. And yet, the city did begin to change. By the end of that year, the new districts were rising. Buildings no longer leaned over alleyways. Roads were straighter. Plazas opened to sky and breeze. Plazas were rebuilt with fresh piping. Carries were spaced apart to reduce fire risk. Even the street signs were redesigned to casual eye. It was progress. But to those who remembered those who had climbed through ash, held their children as tenements fell, it felt like forgetting, because the new Rome didn't smell like the old Rome. It smelled of stone dust and imported marble. It sounded like chisels and hammers, not street vendors and laughter. And in place of the city that had grown by chaos and choice, there now stood a city grown by command, one that bore Nero's fingerprints and waited to see whether the hand that drew its lines would remain steady or set it aflame once more. Asterisk, the cranes never stopped moving. Wooden scaffolding stretched like ribs across half-built porticos. Bricklayers formed lines along wide new boulevards, stacking the city back together, one symmetrical block at a time. The clang of iron, the rhythm of hammers, and the scrape of stone filled the air where, only months before, the screams of burning had echoed to many outsiders. It looked like a triumph. Rome was returning, but for those still living in its dust, the sound was not progress, it was exclusion, because Nero's new Rome was not built for those who had lived in the old one. The emperor's rebuilding plan, lavish, ambitious, praised by poets, was designed with three things in mind: fire prevention, aesthetics, and imperial control. Safety, beauty, and visibility. But never once did his proclamations mention the word home. And so, the poor who had once lived in the Subura, in the Velabrum, in the alleys beside the Forum, found themselves watching from the sidelines. Their homes had been condemned in silence. Their streets were redrawn without consent. In their place came monuments, colonnaded walkways, mosaic plazas, new temples to forgotten gods, all following the emperor's precise vision. He wanted a Rome of spectacle, not survival. A city that would stun ambassadors and outshine Athens. Not a city for bakers and cobblers and pot-sellers to the imperial eye. Rome had been reborn. To the rest, it had been replaced. The new building. Codes, while praised by senators and scribes, created a barrier few could overcome. Requirements for fireproof construction drove up costs. Builders were forced to use brick, concrete, and stone materials out of reach for most commoners, and even those who could afford it found the bureaucracy nearly impenetrable. Permit offices overflowed with petitions. Clerks, many of them newly promoted freedmen of imperial patrons, demanded bribes just to review documents. Entire neighborhoods were classified as strategic zones and repurposed for government use. Houses were torn down before applications could even be read. Some called it progress, others called it confiscation. And amidst this, Nero's own palace complex began to rise. The Domus, Aurea, the Golden House, stretched wider by the month. What had once been crowded city blocks was now open space for the emperor's pleasure. Artificial lakes, man-made hills, shaded groves, mosaic-floored galleries. The fire had made it possible. The reconstruction had made it legal. The people murmured, not loud enough to be punished, but just loud enough to be heard behind closed doors. They spoke of the way the city gleamed at dawn. Yes, but also of the way it echoed at night, because Nero's Rome was spacious in all the wrong ways. Gone were the tight courtyards where children played. Gone were the rooftops close enough to speak between. Gone were the shaded alleys where a woman could sell garum and a boy could sleep in the open without fear. Now there were boulevards, but no neighbors, fountains, but no feet around them, public squares, that somehow felt private. Even the gods seemed uncertain. Some temples were rebuilt grander than before, but with unfamiliar offerings. Statues of Apollo began to resemble Nero. Dedications mentioned divine wisdom, but always tied it to imperial vision. Rome's sacred spaces began to reflect not the past, but the present ruler. And still, rebuilding marched on. No expense was spared. Columns were shipped from Africa, marble from Egypt, skilled laborers imported from Greece. Architects praised in Nero's inner circle received land, titles, in public celebration. And beneath all this, beneath the plans and the plaster and the poems of praise, lay the people who had made Rome, now displaced, now voiceless, now told they had survived not to return, but to watch. The irony was bitter. A fire that had consumed the city in 6 days had given birth to a vision that would take years to complete, and yet somehow feel less alive than what had come before. Even the wind seemed to carry something different now. It blew not the scent of roasted grain or fresh wool, but of lime dust, chalk, and cooling concrete. The Rome of marketplaces and washing lines had been paved over by the Rome of order. A senator, visiting one of the new public atriums, reportedly said, "At last, we have a capital worthy of an empire." But a girl, walking barefoot through a lane where her mother once sold figs, whispered something else. "It's too wide to hold a song."